It's often to generate anger and grievance. That can lead to greater participation. It can lead to greater violence produced by the side that's pushing it and its supporters.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. Misinformation is rampant in conflict and war, and the extent to which people believe misinformation can often impact the trajectory of those conflicts. But when is misinformation actually believed, and when is it not? My guest today, Daniel Silverman, is an assistant professor of political science at Carnegie Mellon and author of a new groundbreaking study on misinformation and war. His new book is called Seeing is Disbelieving: Why People Believe Misinformation in War and When They Know Better. In case studies spanning from Pakistan, Iraq, and Syria, Daniel Silverman identifies the circumstances in which people are more or less vulnerable to misinformation, with the conclusion that the closer people are to conflict, the less credulous they become. In our conversation, we kick off by discussing what we mean by misinformation in war before going through his conclusions from those three case studies. As regular listeners know, one of my favorite kind of episodes I do is take policy-relevant academic research and bring them to you, the policy audience that ought to be consuming this kind of research. I love these kinds of episodes, and I learned a lot from my conversation with Daniel Silverman. Just a couple of quick things before we start. First, we are running a promotion in which you can access 40% off to a full subscription to Global Dispatches. Please visit globaldispatches.org or the show notes of this episode to take advantage of this special promotion. We're running it for a limited time. With access, you can unlock regular essays by me, transcripts of episodes, and full access to our sister podcast about the UN, To Save Us from Hell. Thank you. Your support really does make a huge difference in my ability to bring you this show week in, week out. And lastly, if you have recommendations of people I should interview or topics I should cover, please let me know. You can use the contact button on globaldispatches.org to get in touch with me. Thank you. Now, here is my conversation with Daniel Silverman, assistant professor of political science at Carnegie Mellon and author of Seeing is Disbelieving: Why People Believe Misinformation in War and When They Know Better. Well, Dan, thanks so much for speaking with me today. I wanted to kick off by asking you, I guess, a fairly basic question. What do we mean by misinformation in war?
Well, thanks so much for having me, Mark. So, misinformation is usually now defined as false information, whether it was spread intentionally or not. That's the way most people studying this define the term. Disinformation, which you'll also hear, is intentionally false information. And then finally, fake news refers to information that's intentionally false that mimics news media coverage. So my work here deals with misinfo, and that's sort of the broadest of these categories.
And so what are some common examples of misinformation in warfare that listeners of this show might, be familiar with or might have encountered in one way or another?
Yeah, so unfortunately, it's an all too common phenomenon and probably increasingly common one today. So, we could look at, for example, Syria, where the recently toppled Assad regime, of course, was notorious for pushing a heavy dose of propaganda, trying to conceal and misdirect its use of chemical weapons against its population, saying that it never happened, saying that they were fabrications by the rebels of the West. We could look at Russia in Ukraine, which also has some pretty notorious pieces and narratives of misinformation in its ongoing conflict. And even its earlier conflict, the Donbass War in 2014-15, there was, for example, a major story they pushed aggressively that there was a Russian speaking child in eastern Ukraine that was crucified, the crucified boy, quote unquote, by Russian state television pushing that. And of course, later was debunked. So there are no angels and demons in most conflicts, I think we know. And many, maybe most combatants have somewhat dirty hands in spreading untrue claims.
What are some of the broader impacts that misinformation has in warfare?
You have to think about why this stuff is being spread. And usually it is to incite and mobilize people in conflicts. It's often to generate anger and grievance. That can lead to greater participation. It can lead to greater violence produced by the side that's pushing it and its supporters. It can also be concealment. We can have misinformation covering up, denying, obfuscating about ongoing atrocities. And then also, I think we should be looking at how it can kind of forestall peace, where you can intervene with inflammatory misinformation when there's potential for a settlement and cause issues that way. So there's a number of effects. I think most of them, maybe there's some countervailing examples, but most of them tend to be escalatory and exacerbating in conflict.
So there's been, I think, a growing body of research around misinformation, disinformation, fake news, and their impact in international affairs and in conflict more specifically. Your research is unique for the fact that you take a fairly granular examination of who believes and who disbelieves misinformation in warfare. Can I just ask you, before we get into the contours of your research and your findings, why do you feel that that is an important question to study and probe in the first place?
To some extent, truthfully, we all study or focus on what drives and motivates us, what we're interested in. I'm very interested in mass politics and public opinion, in frankly, the human mind and how people think about political issues. And so a lot of my research is on that. I do think that, of course, bottom up processes are not exclude the only important layer, but they're extremely important in conflicts, and they shape events on the ground and who participates. And they also shape the behavior of strategic elites thinking about how to prosecute conflicts.
So this question of like who believes, who doesn't believe, has much broader impact beyond the individuals themselves that are believing or disbelieving in misinformation.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Impacts of the ugliest kind, especially when you might look at wartime propaganda and media that's sort of led to some terrible violence, things like in the Rwandan genocide. And there's a number of negative vectors of that information. Misinfo could be part of that ugly tapestry, but absolutely, I think we can point to its impacts. So we might look at its very dangerous impacts in conflict. We might look at, for example, Myanmar in the last decade or so as well, where there was quite a deluge of misinformation and fake news about the country's Rohingya minority that played at least an important facilitating role, it seemed, in a case of serious ethnic cleansing.
So before we get into your findings, I'm interested in learning how you went about researching this question of, who in the context of hot conflict, hot warfare, believes misinformation about the warfare in which they are a participant or a victim.
Right. These are the challenges, and I'm not the only one confronting them, but a whole host of researchers and practitioners as well, of just figuring out what's going on the ground level, at the micro level in conflict. The book uses what we would call mixed methods, right? So there's a lot of quantitative data. There's public opinion surveys, some by me and by others. I don't think you can do this without really knowing the cases, really pouring exhaustively through the anecdotal empirical record. and spending time in key places that you're talking about. So it's steeped in that kind of evidence as well. So we could get into the main case in the book. Pakistan is one where I spent time and I'd be happy to talk about that and others in the Middle East, Iraq, and Syria.
Yeah, your book really takes a dive into three key case studies: the U.S. drone campaign in Pakistan, the U.S.-led anti-ISIS airstrike campaign in Iraq, and then Syria as well. So let's go through those, starting with Pakistan. What did you set out to try to learn about misinformation in the context of the U.S. drone program in Pakistan?
Well, started seeing this debate around drones around a decade ago and hearing these very different split narratives about what was going on and what Pakistanis thought was happening in the country. And as I dug a little deeper, I realized there were just very divergent, even factual understandings within Pakistani society. Eventually networked around this issue with Pakistanis and visited the country with the help of some friends and colleagues, traveled around, talked to journalists and officials and so on, and did some data collection as well. And ultimately, what's so striking is that the drone campaign mostly happened in one slice of the country, relatively small one, called the tribal regions, or FATA, the federally administered tribal areas on the Afghan border, that's had a long, volatile history over there. Pakistan, of course, is a huge, populous, vibrant country of 200 million people. And so a lot of the politics and the controversy was coming from very far away from that. Official from a neighboring province to Fatah remarked that the further away people were from the drones, the more worked up they seemed to get. So as some of this stuff was coming out, there was a trickle of testimony as well that started to come out from people more connected, journalists, scholars, to the tribal regions, actually pushing a strong counter narrative because, of course, the drones were really anathema in Pakistani society at large. And there was a strong narrative that they were indiscriminate. They were overwhelmingly, if not exclusively, killing civilians, causing large mass atrocities regularly. And that was sort of a powerful picture. There were thousands of protests. It was shaping Pakistani politics. This was during sort of late Bush into Obama years. And that was resonant internationally. That's, I think, what many in the West thought. Even today, you can hear residues of this, of people, the word sort of drone comes up. And it wasn't true. It just fundamentally is not true.
Not true, the idea that these drones were overwhelmingly indiscriminate and caused mass civilian casualties at like a highly frequent rate?
Correct. Exactly. I mean, we could frame the issue, and phrase it in slightly different ways, but really you come to a hard wall there that is not the picture you get by the civilian populations who actually live with and experience the drones. So those within the tribal areas, especially the areas that most experience the drones, were saying maybe they're annoying and they make buzzing sounds, but they tend to be pretty precise. They overwhelmingly target the militants. They're nothing like the Pakistani army jets and the Pakistani Taliban attacks that are pounding us and flattening our villages. The terms they were using for them there's a term for a buzzing insect, but they were also using terms that mean things like white angels or the holy swallows that protected the Kaaba in the Quran. And so there was this trickle of thought about this. And I myself found it, and as I dug deeper, just confirmed at every turn when I spoke with the locals in and out of the country. And by now, at this point, there have been really serious investigations by a couple of Pakistani political scientists doing hundreds of interviews of displaced tribals and really finding the same thing. So I don't mean to say that I discovered this phenomenon. It's a fascinating and important phenomenon. And I think I seized on it, but to the great credit of others who helped also do that. But I think what I came to realize was there was something much more fundamental and powerful happening that generalized into modern warfare. And so that this gap between frontline populations who are very hard to fool and more removed ones and aggrieved removed ones that are very susceptible to dangerous incendiary misinformation is a really common general issue.
So essentially, those Pakistanis who are most directly impacted by the US led drone campaign in the federally administrated tribal areas are more likely to have a nuanced perspective on the impact of that drone campaign than Pakistanis, say, in like Karachi or elsewhere, who might be more inflamed by it, thinking that there is more civilian casualties than actually were the case.
Yeah, I vividly remember driving in a car, weaving through Islamabad traffic. I was being driven and having one connection of mine who was from the tribal areas and another from Punjab in the car with me. And the gentleman, a smart, educated person from Punjab, I think casually mentioned something that was the predominant narrative about drones and it's horrible, all the civilian casualties. And the resident from the tribal area said, wait a minute, that's not true. Here, let's talk about it. So you could see that divide within the car, but it was a powerful one in the country as a whole.
And I should say, this is not to say that the U.S. drone campaign did not result in civilian casualties. I mean, it certainly did.
Oh, absolutely.
And there's like a whole, debate to be had about the propriety of these drone campaigns and whether or not they served their intended results, whether or not they were useful, whether or not they were illegal. But we're sort of separating that kind of big picture question about the propriety of the drone campaign to the more narrow question of what impact does this drone campaign have on public opinion and how that public opinion is shaped through information and misinformation and whether or not what sort of populations believe this kind of information or misinformation.
100%. And that's where this issue of looking carefully at the facts and thinking about what is or isn't might be called misinformation becomes so crucial when there are when it runs up against powerful worldviews and ideologies and values and predispositions, which happens, of course, in conflict when we can get into the war in Gaza and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and all the ugly misinformation in there. And there's a reason it's so successful on all sides because it can latch on to all of that. And so it becomes hard for people to really key in on these uncomfortable, inconvenient facts. And we've all seen it happen here in the US as well.
So if, the Pakistani populations in areas that were routinely droned by the US were perhaps more like welcoming, it sounds, of those drone strikes than Pakistani populations elsewhere, what like political implications did that result in?
My answer would be that I think there's evidence suggestive that it affected maybe how the campaign played out locally, and that was different than sort of its national level impacts, which I think were pretty. Of course, it was laid on a foundation of sort of suspicion of the U.S. and tensions for other reasons, deep tensions. But I think it inflamed those tensions and inflamed the U.S. Situation around the U.S. presence in the country. It helped the populist Prime Minister Imran Khan, in part, come to power around that time or after. So it had all these effects or contributed to them nationally. I think locally, the evidence and research that I've seen, the best research suggests that the campaign was pretty effective locally, and that would be affected by local dynamics of public opinion.
It sounds as if the results broadly that you found in Pakistan's were replicated in similar studies in Iraq and Syria, namely that civilian populations most directly impacted by, in the case of Iraq, like drone strikes or airstrikes, were less susceptible to misinformation about those strikes than broader populations. So, can you maybe walk listeners through your other two key case studies and what you found?
I was able to get access to a survey, a public opinion survey, national survey, around 2016 in Iraq that was sort of, some of the high points of the US-led air war against ISIS in the country, which, had been underway full throttle for a couple of years after ISIS's big blitzkrieg in 2014. So that survey asked some questions. This is more of a quantitative look at it, but it asked questions about some misperceptions around that campaign, including that it was primarily targeting the PMF, which is sort of collection of predominantly Shia militias in the country, the Hashd al-Shabi, that was also fighting ISIL, had been raised to fight ISIL. Now, things that unravel later between the US and the PMF and some parts of it. But at that time, they were roughly uneasily on the same side. And there was absolutely no policy of bombing the Shia militia in the country. And we have data to that. There were maybe, I think I saw roughly 50 around friendly fire incidents on that front out of around 10,000 airstrikes. And those were friendly fire incidents. So the idea that it was primarily targeting this group with which it had an uneasy but real working alliance to fight ISIS was just untrue. And there was a couple other things there. But, there's, of course, again, a lot of tensions and suspicions that these things can play on here. And so there was real variation in Iraqi society and people's, whether they were believing in this. So we found that ultimately people really had experienced or lived in the communities that had experienced something of the air campaign were much, much less likely to believe this stuff. It was dropped from around 50-60% to more like 30. So it's pretty big. And this was now at the time when these areas were sort of being liberated through a combination of these forces and uncovered. So you were really able to get at, to Cretes and the Ramadis and the so on and so forth, and get at detailed information about how long people had lived under ISIS and where they lived. And so I think that was nice to see that there was a really confirmatory picture there. So that was Iraq and more quantitative picture. And then I wound up for the third major leg of the tripod here, studying this in Syria. And I owe great credit to a friend and collaborator who wrote an excellent book, Surviving the War in Syria, where he interviewed a couple hundred Syrian refugees in Turkey, really detailed, comprehensive, qualitative interviews about their kind of wartime experiences and understandings. And he was able to share his sort of anonymized data. And there were a couple things it got at rumors in the war and asked all about what sort of rumors they believed, how they thought about their truth or falsity, how confident they were. And basically, it was detailed qualitative evidence in all its harrowing detail about what Syrians had lived through, all sorts of rumors about, who was moving where and what atrocities had happened, whether Assad had been killed and all this, but that people who had really spent more time and seen more different types of violence in the conflict were much more confident in their ability to sort truth and false, and just spoke entirely differently about that.
So I guess I'm interested in having you maybe like take a step back and explain to like the broader international affairs community listeners, like why it matters to be able to discern the circumstances in which individuals are able themselves to discern misinformation from veracity. Why does this matter?
There's a couple of reasons. There are various ways we've long thought in scholarly communities and military community circles and so on about how individuals contribute to warfighting and events on the battlefield. But even beyond that, I mean, we can see how important populations are to the information environment that we get around the world about these conflicts, right? And so whether you want to talk about Ukraine or Israel, Gaza, or wherever, this is even sort of growing. There's a tremendous phenomenon of people sharing their information. This question of dueling different information narratives and what people believe is happening in the conflict. I think that's one really important area, and one where you can see beyond even events on the battlefield, this local bottom-up dynamics mattering, being contested, and there's fighting about what's going on in all these cases. But that's one way you can see it sort of rearing its head and reaching audiences beyond the area and influencing global perceptions and policy. So I think that the takeaway is that we really should be trying to amplify those audiences and those voices. There's this dangerous misinformation. There tends to be a much less credulous situation where frontline populations often know better. And so finding ways to sort of lean on them, lift them up, and that could be done by a whole host of people, journalists, governments, ordinary citizens, and even social media platforms. That's kind of what I wanted to leave folks with as the actionable thought out of the book.
Yeah, which is, if you want to learn the truth, speak to the people most directly impacted.
100%.
Well, Dan, thank you so much for your time. This was great.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.